So today we're going to talk about a type of photography that I can honestly say I probably won't be doing anytime soon. It's adventure photography with Alex Buisse on Behind the Shot. Hi, welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm Steve Brazill, and this is the show where we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind one of their shots. I've got a great show lined up for you today. I do want to remind you, if you want to see the show notes for today or the little bit that I wrote about my guest today, a small gallery of his work, you can always head to the website. It's at behindtheshot.tv. My personal site, if you are interested in following me, is stevebrazill.com. And for that matter, if you want to follow me on social media, I've kind of abandoned Facebook. The pages for both the podcast and myself are still there, though. But mostly I spend my time at Twitter or Instagram. Personal is at Steve Brazill. It's like the country Brazil, but 2 L's. And the podcast is at Behind the Shot TV. So a couple things to let you know. Oh, one other thing I almost forgot to tell you is if you're watching on YouTube, because the podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts in audio only or video, meaning if you have a podcast app like Apple Podcasts that supports video, you'll see 2 feeds when you do a search. If your podcast outlet of choice does not support video, you can always head over to YouTube to watch the video. And same thing, show notes are right down there below the like button. Just head on down, read what you want. All the links that we talk about are there, although there is a little bit more information over at the blog post. And that brings me to today's guest, which I have been excited about this all week long. I've done a lot of shows. Never have I done photography like this before. I want to welcome to the show, Alex Buisse. Alex, how are you?
Hi, Steve. I'm doing really well, thank you.
It's so nice to finally meet you. And I should tell people ahead of time, I've been rehearsing your last name. And there will be a point during the show that I probably end up saying Smith just to make it easier. But Alex Buisse, you are an adventure photographer. You're kind of based out of Canada and France. Is that a good description?
I used to be based entirely out of France, and I moved to Canada about a year ago. And now I'm pretty permanently in Canada.
Okay. There's a couple of things about you as I was researching you I found very, very interesting. So you're a climber yourself, and the type of photography you do, when I say adventure photography, is pretty out there, extreme mountain climbing, rock climbing, et cetera, et cetera. You started photography about the same time that you started climbing, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So
the 2 really fed each other.
And that's what I want to know. Those 2 worlds arguably are completely different, right? One is, I guess they're both artistic in many, many ways. They're both technical, but yet they're still completely different. How do those 2 worlds complement each other in your mind or in your life?
I think I was initially attracted really to landscape photography and discovering the great outdoors and the great mountain ranges, and then the activity of climbing, first rock climbing and then alpine climbing, really gave me the inspiration and the motivation to do more climbing so I could take more photos of more extreme places and then activities. And then the other thing is that my interest in photography was born out of a bit of a frustration that I was going into the mountains and seeing those absolutely breathtaking views. And I would take photos of them with whatever camera I had, and I would come home and it would look pretty terrible and absolutely nothing like what I remembered. So that motivated me to become a better photographer, to try and get a better camera, but also understand how to take pictures better and how to translate what I had actually seen better. So in that sense, there was kind of this emulation between the climbing and the photography that kind of kept pushing each other.
What's fascinating about what you just said, though, is your desire to become better at photography was entirely self-serving in that you wanted to capture those moments for you. And yet in doing so, you have so benefited the climbing world as a whole, the media around that space of climbing, and the people who, like you, for example, sell posters, the people who appreciate that type of a thing. But here's the other thing I found about you that I thought was interesting. I know more photographers that have studied computer science and IT than probably anybody I've ever met. It's always photographers. Like literally everybody. My buddy Aunt Pruitt, me, I could go on and on. So my question to you is that's another technical world.
Yeah.
What do you think? I've tried to answer this for myself before. What do you think the connection is between geekery and photography? And then, of course, how does that tie in to your photography?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I will add another data point to it in that so many climbers are actually scientists and especially physicists, but there's a lot of mathematicians as well, like widely
Really?
overrepresented. Yes, if you look at alpine climbers in particular, there's just so many theoretical scientists, and I'm not sure why that is. But I think there is, especially when you go into the geekery, and there was definitely a period of my time where I was like playing with the Linux kernel and doing all sorts of spending hours in front of a computer, coding and whatnot, that there is some of that happening with photography as well, that you can really experiment and break things and play with things in a very creative way while still um, in a technical field. And I think the price of entry is so much um, easier or smaller than learning how to paint or learning how to draw, which I think also would be a great creative outlet. But you can just pick up a camera and without really knowing what you're doing, start taking pictures of, leaves in the rain and long exposures of waterfalls or whatever. That very easily, very quickly, you get stuff that really makes you feel good about having expressed some creativity.
And there is a creativity in both. For example, when I
Absolutely.
design or create a network infrastructure, or as you say, do
Mm-hmm.
coding, is I kind of approach my post production. I think mentally, I should actually analyze that
Mm-hmm.
at some point. I think mentally, I kind of approach my post production in the same analytical way
Mm-hmm.
that I approach my IT background. I just love the tie in there. So let's get
Sure.
into your adventure stuff, because there's a couple of interesting highlights in your career. I'm going to list a couple off.
Sure.
And on each and every one, you may see me make facial expressions like, wow. Okay. You sailed an expedition yacht around Cape Horn.
Mm-hmm.
You, at the same time, were able to photograph Usain Bolt at the Olympics.
Yes.
You skied to the North Pole.
Yeah.
You climbed K2.
No, I climbed on K2.
Climbed on K2.
I didn't actually
Okay.
reach the summit.
And then here's the one that blew my mind, because I love the way you actually wrote this one on your website. You got winched from a rescue helicopter at night on purpose.
Yes.
Do you get afraid?
Yes, I get it. I think fear is very healthy in the mountains in general. But I think there is a tendency, once you put a camera in front of your face, to forget about a lot, and that can actually be dangerous in my field. I have some memories of when I was learning to paraglide, and I was getting into that really dangerous spot where you start being proficient enough that you gain confidence, but you're not proficient enough that you can actually get yourself out of bad situations. That's the really tricky part. And I would just let go of everything and start taking pictures from the air because it's spectacular and an unusual point of view. And then I would realize that I was actually flying straight into a cliff because I was just so focused on a camera. And I just forget everything else. And when I do big photo shoots in the mountains, especially alpine climbs, there's different formats that I can take. But when it's for a client and it's a kind of a big production where I really have to bring the bark, I will typically have a mountain guide just ensure my safety. Even though if I was by myself, I would be perfectly able to do the climb, no problem. But if I have somebody, I can delegate all of the safety decisions, and I can just focus on the camera, then that can actually that is a lot safer than me trying to do both at the same time. Because again, once I have the camera in front of me, I tend to really focus on the image making.
Which it would demand. But where you are at now has gotten you to a client list that, both in that adventure space and elsewhere, is kind of a who's who. We're talking Patagonia, Sports Illustrated, Red Bull, BMW, Nissan, Microsoft, Adidas, CNN, Black Diamond, Nat Geo, Garmin. Your pedigree from a client point of view is so well established.
Yeah.
which then brings me to the way that I found you. There is a company known as Wonderful Machine, and they reached out to me and said, hey, we work with a set of photographers. Joe McNally is represented by Wonderful Machine, if I recall correctly. And the first name they brought to me was you. Hey, would you be interested in having him on a podcast? And I went and looked at your site and went, hell yeah, please. And I had heard of Wonderful Machine. I wasn't exactly sure what role they played in a photographer's life. Can you explain that relationship?
Yes, I can explain it from my point of view as a photographer. So as a client of Wonderful Machine, and for me, they are kind of halfway between a traditional rep and a directory of photographers, and they vet the photographers, the ones who make into the directory pretty thoroughly, and then they provide a lot of marketing services, and they have different departments on top of that. One of them being that they can produce your shoot if you want, and then they take an hourly rate or help you bid for a shoot when you have a big client come knocking. And they can also take your portfolio on the road and go meet with clients on your behalf. But for the most part, it is about having a directory of really vetted high-end photographers that clients can then, when they are wondering, I need a photographer in Europe who specializes in climbing photography, then they can find. I mean, now they can't anymore, but if they need somebody in Canada, then they can find.
Well, and I will say,
easily.
when you browse through the list of photographers that they do represent, it is a who's who, and there's over 600, as I recall, photographers. So I just wanted to say thank you to Bridget for reaching out to me. Cold call was wonderful, and I appreciate you introducing me to Alex here. I introduced you as an adventure photographer. I'm curious how you define, because really when you look through your portfolio, it's adventure photography, but even there, it's somewhat varied in your end results, right? How do you describe adventure photography?
Well, I don't necessarily entirely describe myself as an adventure photographer. I'm going into different directions as well. And I'm trying to do more industrial work, especially now that I'm in Alberta. And I also have an entirely different facet of my work, which is humanitarian photography, which is not on a website because it's just too complicated to explain to potential clients on a website. It's just too weird to have humanitarian and adventure. But adventure photography, I've actually never thought about how you define it. It would be photography that is very authentic and has a more editorial, I think, feel to it, in that there is this implicit contract with the viewer. What you see is the real thing. When you see Alex Honnold climbing El Cap without a rope, he really didn't have a rope. It's not like Jimmy Chin photoshopped the rope out, even though that would be very easy to do. So there is that notion that what you see is the real adventure. And then the other thing that makes it a bit unique is that in almost every case, the photographer needs to be participating in the activity to some extent. I take photos of world-class climbers, and I'm far from one. So there's definitely ways of, setting ropes up and getting a slightly easier way, or sometimes even using a helicopter to access some parts. But in general, I have to be very at ease in the mountains, very at ease sailing, very at ease in the environment, so that I can not only survive and not only go on the adventure, but also have enough brain power left to take the photos.
Honesty, I'm going to use the word honesty that you kind of describe, I see in your work. There's a photojournalistic, documentarian viewpoint from your photographs, and yet that documentarian viewpoint is brought up to the level of a world-class cinematographer, almost in a movie. And I appreciate that blending of storytelling, authentic storytelling, with cinematography, light placement, use of light, use of composition. I'm assuming you hit limits with your gear out there sometimes, do you not? The temperatures, etc.
Well, usually, no, not really. I mean, I will cease functioning way before my camera dies, typically. I have some photos of my camera in the North Pole, and it's covered in frost, and it's working just fine. I think in the days of digital, you have to go to pretty serious extremes to damage the gear or to see the limitations of the gear. In the days of film, I've heard about people on the summit of Everest where the film is tearing because of the cold and the lack of oxygen. To be honest, I haven't encountered that really. What I encounter is more I do like light. I do like good light, and I do try to use light, artificial light outside in some situations, but it is often very difficult to do in the mountains proper. And that's kind of more the limitation is having to move quickly over ground because conditions are constantly changing. And for safety, you need to be, sometimes away from the mountain
Right.
before the snow melts too much, that sort of situation. Or you're in an avalanche path and you don't want to linger. And so that makes it difficult to get people to do things multiple times or to set up nice lighting gear from 3 different angles, and that sort of thing. That's one of the limitation I can see. Having to work with the conditions, having to be very flexible, rather than kind of setting things up in a very
Okay.
planned way.
So, just a quick reminder to everybody, the show is available wherever you get your podcasts, audio or video only. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have video in your podcast app, which you do in the Apple Podcasts or a lot of the native podcast apps, but if you're listening on Spotify or Amazon or something like that, and you don't have a video option there, you can always head over to YouTube. Also, I want to take a second to thank my friends over at DVE Store. It's dvestore.com. You can head there for all your digital video equipment needs. They're responsible for the HD video on the podcast, so I thank them very, very much for that. And I want to get into today's image, and I'm not even sure where to begin because, again, this is a type of photography. All the shows I've done, and I always try and vary it up, right? I'm a music photographer, and early on, I was always afraid people are going to just think it's a live concert photography show. So I almost avoided it to an extreme. But never have I had anything like this. And this shot, I just have to tell you, Alex, it's not only beautiful. Like if there was not a person in here, this would just be a really cool, beautiful shot, right? But then you add the person, you add the composition, you add the color and the power of it. And this is just absolutely stunning. This is Jeff Mercier climbing out of the depths of a moulin, a crevasse at Mer de Glace in Chamonix, France. Did I get all of that right?
You did.
Okay. Explain, first of all, is Jeff a friend of yours?
He is. He's also one of the best ice and mixed climbers in the world. He's a member of the elite rescue unit, the PGHM. If you are climbing in Chamonix somewhere or in the French Alps and you get in big trouble for whatever reason, then he is going to be one of the people coming to rescue you on a helicopter or on foot, depending on conditions. And he is, again, one of the very best ice climbers and mixed climbers in the world.
So before I get into the technical stuff, because I want to touch on that for those that are kind of into the technical stuff, is it my understanding that Chamonix, there's a lot of climbing going on? Is that like a climbing capital of the world for this?
Yes, it very much is. So not necessarily for ice climbing. There's many disciplines of climbing, but when it comes to alpine climbing and alpine rock climbing, it is one of the very best places in the world. And the access you get to the high mountains is unparalleled because there's a number of lifts. And then if you don't know the topography of Chamonix, it is sitting at 1,000 meters, about 3,000 feet of elevation. And you have Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in Western Europe, that's at 4,810 meters, which is just under 15,000 feet within like 2 horizontal kilometers. So you have walls of granite and glaciers just towering over you immediately above town. It's a really unique place.
You know what? Before we get into the technical, you just said something that makes me want to just inject this in really quick. And that is, you do have, I mentioned it earlier or alluded to it earlier, you do have climbing posters. And when you mentioned Mount Blanc, that kind of ties into the URL.
Sure.
Where can people find your climbing posters at?
So the climbing posters at montblanclines.com. And what they are is I've been taking high resolution photos of some of the most famous and some more obscure climbing venues in the world. A lot in the Alps, a lot in the US and Canada, and there's also K2, and enjoying every single climbing route on them. I just finished El Cap, which is a pretty ridiculous one in terms of the amount of details that there is. And it's kind of half between a fine art poster and half between a climbing guidebook. It's a bit of project that grew out of COVID. COVID lockdown and forced computer time and kind of expanded into a side business.
This shot, first of all, as I mentioned, it's Jeff in Chamonix, France. But do you title your images? Does this shot have a name?
I don't typically title my images because they always end up being like moulin or crevasse or skiing. Or, it gets very repetitive and
person on skis.
Yes.
Let's hit the technical side of this.
Sure.
And correct me. I know you've got it in front of you. Correct me if any of this is
sure.
incorrect. EXIF data showed aperture priority, ISO 2000, 1/180th of a second, f4, 16 millimeters on a Nikon D850. 16 to 35 f4. White balance was set to auto. My first question. Why aperture priority for you?
I shoot 99% of my work in aperture priority. That is really something. I trust my camera, and I have now shot close to 1 million images. And I am really pretty happy with the matrix metering of Nikon cameras in general. So I trust them quite extensively. And it's one less decision that I have to do when I'm shooting. I don't want to miss shots, so I don't want to get exposure widely out of whack because I'm too focused on my composition, and then I forget to adjust the aperture or the shutter speed. So I usually try to set the ISO to a happy medium where I'm gonna get good quality, but I'm still gonna get a good enough shutter speed. And then I set my aperture where I want it, which a lot of the time is f8, but in dark situations like this one, it might be f4, which is as wide open as my lens will go. And then I just let the shutter speed do its own thing, while keeping an eye on it to make sure it's, I'm not gonna get blur.
Right. Which actually was going to be my question was you went f4 on this, which seems really shallow, except that you're at 16 millimeters. So it's not as shallow as you would think it would be.
Exactly.
But are you not worried as you're up there? I mean, 180th seems that could be slow in this scenario. Could it not?
It could be slow. Ice climbing is a sport that it's a succession of fast movement with relatively static in between. So when Jeff swings his ice axe, there's some really fast action, and then kind of, if you're lucky, the ice sprays everywhere and can be very spectacular. And then there is getting to a relatively static position so that he can establish himself on all 4 points and then kind of move his legs relatively slowly. And it's relatively predictable as well. It's not like football where you have the ball kind of going everywhere, hockey, God forbid. In this case, I kind of knew that it was a happy medium, and I wanted to keep the ISO to a relatively low setting, which is 2000, because I knew I was going to have to get some dynamic range, because I wanted to get from the really bright reflections. It's a bright sunny day when I'm shooting this, and the surface is maybe 10 meters, 30-ish feet above me. So I wanted to have the reflection of that, which would be quite bright, and then the endless depth of the tunnel, which goes into pitch black. So I didn't want to get my ISO too high and then lose that dynamic range. And that's why I compromised more on the shutter speed, and I was timing my shots to have a good, interesting body position, but to not have too much movement.
So you're 30 feet below the surface here in the crevice like yourself. And obviously Jeff is farther down than you.
Yeah.
And you have the wherewithal in your mind to think about, to slow it all down, I would almost guess, and process the composition and the fact that you want the dynamic range. I love that in this situation you can process that clearly. For those of you that are on the audio feed, I'm going to describe this photo to you. And when we're done, Alex will tell me where I messed up at. So it's a landscape orientation shot, kind of a standard ratio, like a 4:3 ratio, maybe a little bit wider than 4:3. You're looking down the crevice, right? So imagine a crevice and picture it in your head almost round, and you're floating in the middle, except you're not. You're kind of at the edge, but like leaning off the edge. And picture in this particular case, the center of that crevice is just below center frame, right? And so you are on the bottom of the frame that's being shot here, kind of leaning off, looking down the crevice. It's shaped oval-like. It's wider left to right than it is tall. Some areas, like in the upper left corner, are really dark. Bottom right corner, more visible, more snow, like a white, almost frost-looking type thing. The center is very clearly very deep. Like it's dark, except for in the middle, on the side, on the wall, there's Jeff climbing this thing, which in and of itself to me is borderline crazy. But I love that this is happening in front of me because you feel like you're there. Like there's that photojournalistic part I was talking about earlier. I feel like I am here with Alex and Jeff. The climber is about a third of the way up from the bottom at 10 o'clock, and his feet are spread to the walls left and right, using a pick in each hand to climb, wearing a white helmet, orange outfit. The walls are bluish. Walls are beautiful, actually. And everything about this just screams of that blue type of ice that you would get on a glacier when you go down below the white surface. And you're getting amazing colors in the wall and whites and blues. And again, areas of pitch darkness. It gives you the feeling of the depth that's in front of you. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate description.
Okay. So Chamonix, France, tell me how this shot came about.
So the moulins are very specific crevasses. They're very unique, and they're actually formed by. In the summer, you have actually little rivers that come down the glaciers. So this is a glacier that has ice year round, but in winter it's covered in snow, and in summer there's a few rivers, and then at some points the rivers, because the water is so much warmer than, even though it's very cold, it's warmer than the ice. It kind of digs down and it burrows down. And imagine if you have a cup of ice cream and then you pour some hot water on your ice cream, is going to kind of drill a hole in the middle. This is exactly the same principle. And those can get really, really deep. And then you have some subterranean rivers that can also happen. But there's a short window in the fall where the rivers have stopped running because it's too cold, but you haven't had a ton of snow yet to fill up the crevasse, where you can actually go and climb in them. And the ice you find is extremely old ice. It might be a few years because of ice melt, but it could be a few decades old, maybe a few centuries if you go deep enough. And it's very, very hard, as in very brittle and very hard to swing your ice axe into, and to put ice screws for protection as well. And so for those few weeks, you can actually rappel into the crevasses and climb out of them. And it's a very popular pastime in Chamonix because you don't have the frozen waterfalls yet that you can climb outside because it's not cold enough. But this you can climb. And then they're just such unique environments. And I have shot in them a number of times before, but at some point, Jeff, who I know well, who's a friend, sent me a message on Instagram one evening saying, "Hey, I'm going climbing tomorrow with a friend. Do you want to come take some photos?" And I just jumped on the opportunity to do that without a client or anything, just because I like going out into the mountains and shooting cool stuff. And sometimes I manage to sell the photos, sometimes I don't. So this was a speculation shoot. And then we did some climbing in some less extreme crevasses. And on the way back to the train to get down to the valley floor, we spotted this absolute monster, which it goes way deeper than it even looks in the photo. And Jeff was very, very confidently upside down. There's his belayer with a yellow jacket. You can just sort of guess he's actually hanging from the wall. So the wall disappears into darkness below his feet. It goes much deeper than he is. And then he started climbing. And for me, it was a matter of where do I set up my own rope? Where do I rappel down to get an interesting angle? Because I don't want to be right on top of him. It won't show the depth enough. And I don't want to be too far away because I still want to have some connection with the climber. So I kind of chose the opposite wall.
Let me interject one question there, because you just said something I'm dying to know. How far away from him are you?
I would say about 20 feet. 15 meters. That would be about 50, 70 feet, something like that. 50 to 70 feet.
Okay. Because what you just said about the fact that you didn't want to be right above him, you wanted a different angle, and positioning him up towards 10 o'clock and you at the bottom was a brilliant composition choice. I apologize interrupting you. Continue.
What I was really aware of is I wanted space for him to climb towards. And that's something that I'm always super conscious, because I shoot action sports. Even when they're relatively slow action, it's still action and he's still moving. And I really wanted the eye to have a lot of the space that he's about to climb on, while still showing the environment around him. And that's kind of why I picked that composition. And I don't remember, honestly, if that was a conscious process, or if it was more like looking down on it and thinking like, yeah, this is the spot, without necessarily being able to express why I picked that particular spot to drop my rope.
So all natural light. There's something in my head, and explain to me why, from a physics point of view, you're now going to put your physics hat on for me. You're 30 feet from the surface.
Sure.
He's, let's call it 50 or more feet from you. So he's inching up close to 100 feet below the surface. I would imagine that darkness I see at the bottom would be engulfing him.
Well, one thing is, again, I'm shooting at 1/180th of a second in ISO 2004. So I'm actually letting a lot of light in. The ambient light level were pretty low. But what I'm absolutely fascinated by with ice in general, and that's why I love shooting ice climbing, is the way it reflects and refracts light. So you have some light that just bouncing, coming from the surface, where again, it's a really bright day and there's snow on the ground, so that makes it even brighter. And then it kind of bouncing back down that shaft. And then you have some bouncing up the walls and kind of getting into all the little funnels. And then you have some getting through the ice when it's not too thick. Like that pillar on his left, there's a little bit of ice that's actually getting through it. And you always get such interesting light. One of the things I love doing the most is shooting ice climbing at night, because then I can set up a few headlights and a few studio lights and strobes and really play with transparency, translucency, and with reflections, and have some absolutely crazy light effects. And that's, again, ice. And then when you add the texture of the old ice with all the layers that are just years and years of ice compressed by the glacier, then you get an environment that's absolutely unique.
I should have mentioned when I described those layers. So somewhat similar to if you see, sedimentary rock, like if you see images of a Grand Canyon, it's that. You've got these clear delineations of layer buildup. That also adds, by the way, to the compositional feel of this image, in that because this is an oval-shaped looking crevice, and then you have those lines, it almost gives you a Fibonacci spiral, golden spiral feel. But I pulled this into Lightroom, and in Lightroom, when you're in the crop tool, if you hit the O key, you can change the overlay. And everything in this image, one of the overlays is diagonal lines that make triangles. This lines up spot on to those diagonal crops. Did you crop this, or is this pretty much framed in camera?
I think this one is out of camera. I have no problem about cropping in general, but I think this one's pretty straight out of camera. In terms of the contrast, not the composition. The composition, not the contrast.
Your compositional mind. And I see this in all of your work. Like I kid you not, I lost a lot of time browsing through your website. And at one point had to yell to my wife, you got to see this. And had her come in to go through your website, because picking the shot alone took a while with you and me going back and forth, because I'm going to be honest with you. There were like 50 shots that I wanted to use in this particular show. When it comes to composition, we now know that as you're on the side of this crevice or on the side of a hill, you're so aware of composition in your mind that you will almost suspend remembering where you're at and the safety features to focus on that shot.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're looking through a viewfinder,
Yeah.
and you are lining up a shot,
Mm-hmm.
how deep do you go? I'm saying this next to a crevice, so this is actually,
Sure.
pun intended. How deep do you go in your mind on composition? Are you thinking of positioning? Are you thinking of, end result? Are you thinking of relationships of objects? Because that's the other thing, is where Jeff is compared to you relationally, the
Mm-hmm.
viewer's eye point to Jeff, also spot on. So are you aware of all of that in camera?
I think, well, first, there's a lot of pre-visualization that's happening, especially here where to set up my rope. I was kind of going through my mind. I was like, okay, if I drop my rope here, then it's going to look like this. And if I drop it there, it's going to look like that. Uh, I I think that conversation happens in my mind, but on a subconscious level for the most part. And it's once I get back on a computer, and sometimes I play with crops, so sometimes it just works from the get go. I realize, oh yeah, this one works because he's in the right spot in the frame, and then there's all those leading lines, and then he's got space to go to, and uh, as you say, the spiral thing. That's something I hadn't even noticed. And it's really interesting because over the past few years, I've been doing some mentorships and a lot of portfolio reviews, and being able to identify that in images, I find really, really interesting. And being able to vocalize, like, this is why this composition works, this is why this composition doesn't necessarily work, or why this composition could be better. Um, but I think overall is that I have consumed so many images, both from my own work, but also a lot from other photographers and from painters and from all sorts of visual media, a lot of movies as well. And there's this huge database in my brain of images and of good composition and bad composition. And I think there's some subconscious process that goes and accesses that database when I have my eye in a viewfinder, and without me realizing, I'm like, yeah, okay, Jeff should be in there. Jeff should be in that position in the frame.
It works. You said something that really struck me, though, and that is that you've looked at so many shots, you kind of know when they work and when they don't work. And one of the things I love, and it doesn't happen often, but periodically a shot ends up in front of me where I look at it and I know it works and I love how it works. And for some odd reason, I can't identify in that specific picture compositionally. I'm not sure what's drawing me in, right? But I can feel it like deep down.
Yeah.
And I kind of love that mystery of trying to figure it out. But this one, everything about this shot pulls you in. Literally, you're going from wide to this little dark spot on the end, and it is pulling you down there with Jeff. So here's a question based on how you shot this. You get back, you pull this in. What's your standard post-processing workflow?
I import in Photo Mechanic, and I do my initial edit in Photo Mechanic because it's a lot faster than Lightroom.
Same here, yeah.
And yeah, so all I do is I mark all the obvious rejects. I mark as rejects, and then I delete immediately. And then I just have yes or no. And the yeses are only if there's any potential whatsoever, I will mark it. And then I import everything in Lightroom, and I do a lot of my work in Lightroom. Actually, basically all of my work in Lightroom. And yeah, in that particular situation, I was very excited because I had a lot of images. There's quite a few from that session. It's not just this one. Because again, it was such a graphic, such a beautiful environment, and such beautiful light that I could have shot pretty much anything and it would have looked good down in that crevasse. But this one really stands out for I think the word you use is very adequate, the mystery of it, because it is such a unique and unusual environment that very few people will have been able to witness in their lives, and the very few people have seen in photos even. Um, and then the contrast in color with the bright red outfit, which I'm forever grateful to Jeff for
That
wearing.
wasn't planned, was
And
it?
he's a sponsored climber, and he has worked with a lot of photographers, so he knows how to make us happy.
Wow. Wow. You should pay
Um,
him for that.
but yeah, oh yeah. Uh, no, he's a really good subject for that sort of stuff. Um,
Do you
but yeah, no, I was very happy with this
Yeah,
one.
it's so gorgeous. Do you have any mobile apps that you use when you're out that you couldn't live without?
Uh, I could definitely live with that, but I use Sunseeker a whole lot to predict where the sun's going to be and to do some pre-planning, especially for landscape. I do more and more planning ahead of time. It's one of the consequences of having kids now is I have less time to just go out and mess around and see what happens, and I kind of need to be a bit more intentional when I go out and shoot. So I do a lot of pre-planning with FatMap. I use a whole lot. I don't know if you're
Nope.
familiar with it, but it's basically a 3D, think 3D Google Earth or 3D, well, Google Earth is 3D, but 3D Google Maps that shows the mountains in a really accurate way. And what's amazing about it is I can select any viewpoint anywhere and say, okay, the top of my hike or the top of my climb is going to be on top of that mountain. What will I be able to see from there? And then I pair that with the photographer's ephemeris. So Google Earth has a feature where you can see where the sun's going to be. And that gives me a pretty accurate way of, okay, the sun's, if I'm on top of this mountain at 4 p.m., I'll be able to see that other mountain with that ridge in the foreground, and then the sun's going to hit that particular feature. So I do that quite a lot now. So again, FatMap and photographer's ephemeris and Google Earth. Otherwise, not really. No, I tend not to look at my phone very much when I'm out in the mountains.
Okay. So let's switch gears. We're going to go into a
Mm-hmm.
speed round. Just answer these as fast as you can. And the truth is,
Sure.
nobody's timing it. Your
Okay.
favorite adventure photography tip. If somebody wanted to try what you do, what's your favorite or best tip for them?
Um, Go out a whole lot and actually do the activity. Don't try to take photos of rock climbing if you're not a rock climber yourself, for instance, because I mean, there's a safety component, but also you just will not understand the activity and how to get appealing images. But if you are a dedicated rock climber, then that's when you can get good rock climbing images. So if your thing is hiking, then try to get some really good hiking photos by going hiking a lot and taking in camera. And I'll add another one. Is keep the camera available at all times. If the camera is in your backpack, I can guarantee you will have a couple from the beginning of the hike and one from the summit and maybe one from the descent. But that moment of magic where you'll have the perfect bend in the trail and the perfect lineup of the legs of your hiking mates and the light is hitting everything just right, you're not gonna bother and get your backpack down, get a camera out, get a photo, and then I often take photos without even stopping walking. I just have it in a little side pouch and just get it up and get it back down.
So that brings in the question, if it's not in your backpack, how are you carrying your camera? Is it
Mm-hmm.
on a strap? Are you using a spider holster
Uh,
or
Various ways. I use Peak Design Capture a lot. I am a Peak Design ambassador and I have been for over 10 years now. Big fan of the Capture, which was the initial device. So that allows you to kind of clip on the backpack strap or on your belt, on
right?
your climbing harness. So I use that a lot. And also use a Think Tank has a line of belt pouches that allow me to carry stuff below my backpack and above my climbing harness typically, and still have really
I
easy
live on the
access.
think tank stuff.
Those are the
I
two.
every shoot I'm
Mm-hmm.
on, I have my think tank belt system on. What is the biggest
There you go.
mistake you almost made or made?
Oh, geez. Well, I've almost died a number of times. So I've been buried in an avalanche. I have almost fell down from the northwest of the Eiger without a rope when a pole broke. I've punched through a crevasse and almost fell down that without a rope. So I've done a lot of things that could have resulted in me being very dead at the bottom of the mountain. those would definitely qualify.
Which is why I started this by saying this is not a type of photography I will probably be doing anytime soon. What is your favorite composition rule if you have one?
That's the one I mentioned earlier. If you have movement, make sure that there is space for your subject to move into. The number one thing I see is people having a hiker and then the hiker's moving left to right in the frame and he's close to the right edge. And then as a viewer, I'm left frustrated because I want to see where he's going. And the faster the movement, the more you space.
Often referred to as nose room, actually, something for them to look into or move into. Yeah. What is?
Yes, that works with gaze
exactly.
as well. Yeah.
What's your favorite drink?
Oh, good IPA, probably, or a good French wine, which is much harder to find in Canada.
And your favorite band or singer?
Sigur Rós would probably take the prize.
Okay. And the final question, is there a photographer out there that you think more people should know about and follow?
Yes, there is a woman photographer. She's a photojournalist. She's called Danielle Villesana, and I'm sorry if I don't say her name properly. And she has done some absolutely amazing documentary work. And there is another one who's a personal friend of mine, and he's a war photographer, just came back from Ukraine for the second time. He's called Eric Bouvet, Bouvet, and his work is absolutely incredible, and he deserves to have more people.
So I will make sure we've mentioned so many links in this show. I am going to, when I edit this, try and find everyone. And if you head to the blog post over at behindtheshot.tv, I will have all the links down at the bottom, along with something that I wrote about my guest here. I've got a whole little bit that I wrote about Alex, and then I've got a 6-shot sample gallery of Alex's work that you can go check out as well. And again, if you're on YouTube, all those links are on YouTube as well. Just head down below the like button, hit the like button on your way down, and all the links are down there. But again, the big paragraph of text that I wrote isn't on YouTube because YouTube does have some character limits. So your best bet at that point is to go over to the blog post. If people want to find you, and those of you watching on video, I have been popping up all of these URLs or social media handles, etc., throughout the show on video. But if you're listening on audio, those are in the blog post or on YouTube as well. But for people just to hear it, if they're driving or something like that, what is your website?
My website is alexbuisse.com. And so for all of the non-French speaker, Buisse is spelled Buisse.
Okay.
So alexbuisse.com.
And Alex Buisse on Instagram and Twitter. Facebook is Alex.
Twitter is not very... I should say that Twitter is more of a personal expression / politics and not so much of a photography. If you want the photo stuff, it's very much Instagram.
Okay. And then also you do have a Facebook page, Alex Buisse Photography.
I do.
And then climbing posters. If people want your climbing posters, where do they go?
They go to www.montblanc.com, and that's the French spelling. So Mont Blanc, Montblanc, and then lines, as you would expect.
L-I-N-E-S,
and there is also a book. Yeah, there's also a book that came out in French and Italian last fall, and that's about to come out in English in October. That is all about, it's the posters, and then it's a decade of adventure photography. It's all about the Mont Blanc range, so above Chamonix in the French and Italian Swiss Alps. Yeah.
Alex, again, can't say it enough. First of all, love the shot and love your work. I cannot say enough, though, how much I appreciate you coming on and talking and joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Alex Buisse, thank you so very much. If you want to know more about Alex, head on over to the website. It's behindtheshot.tv. If you want to follow me anywhere, my website is stevebrazill.com, like the country Brazil, but 2 L's. If you want to follow me on social media, either myself or the podcast, Instagram and Twitter are the 2 best places. It's at Steve Brazill or at Behind the Shot TV. And again, if you're on YouTube, please leave a comment. Throw a like button down there, subscribe if you would. In fact, if you are listening to this or watching this on a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, it is available in audio only or video. And I would really appreciate it if you like what you're hearing, if you like what you're seeing, give us a 5-star review, drop a written review. I check them often, and it really does help with discoverability. But to everybody, regardless, thanks very much for watching. I'm Steve Brazill. Make sure you join us on the next show as we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind the shot.